thanks for coming along. I just wanted to say a couple of things about the format of these visual politics seminars. The whole idea is basically to have something very informal where people can present work in progress, stuff they want to get feedback on in a sort of constructive environment rather than in a showing off type of manner. So it's all about support, and the idea is to let people speak at maximum half an hour. In a couple of the previous sessions, people went on too long, so we had almost no time left for discussion. The whole idea is to have a dialogue, and we run it for 1 hour just because people have a big time commitment during the semester, so we don't want to max people with an hour slot, and that's sort of feasible. That's the idea. I'd like to thank Alison for that we can use the boardroom here. That's fantastic. So partly because it's a wonderful setting, and it's not in a particular department. So, and yeah, we'll have another three or four sessions left later in the semester. So I'd like to introduce then Simone Molin Friis, who's visiting us from Copenhagen. She's a PhD student there, works with Lene Hansen. Is an excellent scholar as well on international relations and security and images. Simone is here until the end of the year, right? So if you want to interact with her, get in touch with her, she would be happy to meet up with people and know more about what you're doing. But I won't say much. I have read the paper that you presented for today. It's fantastic. It's a very impressive piece of scholarship, well researched, well presented, and I look forward to discussing it with you in more detail. So we'll give you about half an hour or less if you want, 30 seconds more if you like, whatever, and then we'll try to help you improve the paper.
Thank you for the kind words, Roland, and thank you so much for giving me this really great opportunity to present at this very exciting seminar series. And thank you for coming. I'm really looking forward to discussing my paper with you. And the paper that I'll be presenting today is entitled Behead, Burn, Crucify, Cross, Theorizing the Islamic State's Public Display of Violence. And as you can probably guess from the title, this is a paper that focuses on the militant group we've come to know as the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL or Daesh. And it particularly focuses on what I call the group's public display of violence. That is how the Islamic State uses violent imagery, videos of state executions, and different forms of violent power displays as a political strategy and technique. And before I present the paper, I should probably say that this paper is a part of a larger project, my PhD project, which examines the relationship between visual politics, political violence and power, focusing specifically on the war against the Islamic State. And what I was very interested in the first year of my PhD was trying to capture the public political response to the Islamic State's videos. How were they responded to politically? What role did they play in the constitution of the Islamic State as the new public enemy in the West? And what I'm trying to do now is to move beyond the focus on the public reception of the videos and more explicitly examine the Islamic State's actual practices and technique. So the kind of questions that I'm asking are, what kind of technique and practice is the deliberate display of cruelty against human bodies? What is the content of the Islamic State's videos? How do they work? Is this new? What is the logic, dynamics, and politics of these violent power displays? So I'm zooming in much more on the actual acts. And this paper is my first attempt at trying to write from this analytical perspective. And what I would like to do in this presentation is three things. First, I'd like to say just a few more words about the case and why it's important, because this is controversial material, so I think it's important to highlight why it is we need to engage with it and why it's not just for the sensationalism of it. Then, after having done that, I'll move on to the most substantial part of the paper, and that consists of two steps. First, I'll present what I call a contextualization of the Islamic State's public display of violence. More specifically, I try to problematize the public political constitution of the Islamic State's violence as an exceptional evil by placing it in a broader historical political context. Then, after having done that, I'll move on to the final part, which is the actual analysis of the Islamic State's videos. And the aim of this part is to try to further our understanding of the Islamic State's display of violence by explicating the distinct logic and dynamics of the group's videos and asking how they function within a broader technology of power. So that's what I'm going to be talking about for the next 20-30 minutes. And I should probably say before I continue that I'm very focused on the visual dimension of this form of violence. So I will be showing a few images from the Islamic State videos. I'm not going to be showing an actual beheading or anything like that, but I will show some screen grabs. But I promise that I'll let you know if I show something that has not been shown in the mainstream media and that's graphic, so you can choose to look away while I show it. So it's completely up to you whether you want to see it or not. Good. So if we start with the case, the Islamic State has really captured the imagination of many societies within the last 2 years. And much has already been written about the group. We have seen articles on the group's military capabilities, its ideology, its terror campaign, its institutional structure, its ability to materialize the caliphate, its religion, its funding structures, and its relationship to other groups such as Al-Qaeda. And all of these themes are very important. But I would argue that the case of the Islamic State is not only significant because of the Islamic State's distinct characteristic as a militant movement, it's also very important because of the group's more symbolic expressive power and the images it has created on a more representational virtual battlefield. So even though the rise of the Islamic State is a complicated phenomenon, it seems hardly debatable that the group's violent imagery and mobilization of spectacular acts of violence have been quite important. During the last few years, the Islamic State has produced a large number of high-definition videos, some of which showed executions, and these videos have been giving quite a lot of international attention. They have been a recurring motive in the mainstream media, at least in the West. They have spurred some quite strong reactions. They have been described as a form of propaganda, and they've been linked to debates about radicalization and terrorism. And very importantly, they have actually also played a quite important role in political debates. Because political leaders and officials have all lined up to interpret and respond to the Islamic State's violence. And very often, these videos have been described as a form of nihilistic destruction or exceptional evil. The Islamic State is the embodiment of evil. It's a network of death. They are unique in their brutality. This is beyond anything we've ever seen. It's an ugly, savage, inexplicable, nihilistic, and valueless evil. It's a group that has no vision other than slaughter. It offers nothing but misery, death, and destruction. And importantly, Obama has even argued that the videos show there can be no reasoning, no negotiation with this brand of evil because the only language understood by killers like this is the language of force. And in many ways, these reactions are understandable. Faced with the triumphal display of deliberate cruelty against unarmed hostages, it is tempting to conclude that these individuals producing this kind of material must be raving mad or evil. However, the description of the acts as exceptional evil may not provide the strongest basis for actually analyzing the situation because it risks obscuring the logic and politics of the Islamic State's message, actions, and appeal. Because as numerous IR scholars have argued in the context of 9/11, a rhetoric of evil madmen advances neither understanding of terrorist horror, nor for that matter the capacity to prevent it. And also very important, this discourse of good versus evil tend to inscribe the situation with the logic of threat, danger, and urgency, and establishes a sense of black and white certitude that may impede democratic deliberation and make the adoption of certain emergency measures appear as the only sensible solution. So even though this is brutal and horrible beyond doubt, it's still important that we try to investigate what it is they're doing, so we try to understand it, not legitimize it or sympathize with it in any way, but understand it. And a very important step toward understanding what it is this group is doing and why it works in this way is to try to place the Islamic State's acts in a broader historical context and try to challenge this exceptionalism argument. Because responses to terrorist violence are very often characterized by a form of obligatory amnesia. We tend to describe each major outburst of terror as an exceptional event, meriting a new and often tougher approach. And as we just saw, the responses to the Islamic State's videos really have been no different. We've seen them described as beyond anything we've ever seen and unique in their brutality. Yet, what has often been neglected in the public debates about the Islamic State's public display of violence is the longer history of the technique. And the next 3 minutes, I'm going to be showing graphic images, so you can choose to look away if you don't want to see them. The deliberate display of cruelty against human bodies is far from unprecedented, nor is it a technique exclusively employed by a jihadist group. Throughout the ages, public torture and executions have recurrently been employed by the state as a punishment and a very public display of sovereign power. As Michel Foucault argued in his seminal work on Discipline and Punish, public dismembering of bodies on the scaffold have for centuries functioned as a technique to restore the balance of power by making visible the triumph of sovereign justice and truth. And while this resort to the public dismembering of bodies have been obviated in many modern states, concurrently with the emergence of other technologies of power, such as the disciplining of the body or the biopolitical control of populations, some modern state authorities actually still mobilize this kind of technique. As an example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Republic of Iran have publicly executed numerous prisoners in 2015. Moreover, the practice of producing videos of state violence is not unique to the case of the Islamic State. During the war in Bosnia and the war in Chechnya in the 1990s, combatants produced several videotapes showing state executions and other forms of atrocities. Perhaps more well known is the execution video from 2002 of the Wall Street Journal journalist Daniel Pearl, which was produced in Pakistan. And we should probably also mention the very, very large, steady flow of execution videos that were produced during the early year of the Iraq War, many of which, of course, were produced by the forerunner of the Islamic State, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So today, the production of execution videos has really exploded. And even though it's primarily the Islamic State's well-produced videos with Western hostages that have received international attention, it's important to be aware of that the typical victims are not Westerners, and it's also important to be aware of that the Islamic State is not the only group currently using the technique. You'll find numerous videos produced by Shiite militias and pro-Assad groups online, and you can also find videos of American soldiers posing with insurgents' dead bodies. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the Islamic State is not the first political agent that mobilizes the public display of cruelty against human bodies, nor are they the only group currently using the technique. Put differently, the violence and the technique in itself is not exceptional. It's a contemporary case of an age-old phenomenon. Yet, what is new about the Islamic State's public display of violence is the visibility and publicity of the act, and the global immersive nature of the spectacle the group has created. Because the media transformation of the 21st century has introduced a number of significant transformation of how images and videos circulate. The speed with which an act of violence can reach a global audience has been greatly accelerated, and therefore the effects of films' atrocities are no longer confined to local or even national arenas, but are visible through the global reach of media communication. Moreover, while militant groups previously depended on being noticed by larger media corporations to get their acts seen, modern multiple media is allowing groups like the Islamic State to present their deeds to a public without relying on being noticed by television networks. If we go to 2002 and the Daniel Pearl video, we saw that the perpetrators had to send a videotape to a media organization or an embassy and then rely on them circulating it to a broader audience. In 2014, the Islamic State could upload the James Foley video on a social media platform, and within an hour it had more or less a global audience, despite the fact that powerful political agents tried to censor it. So there's a different kind of speed and reach in the circulation of this material. And what's interesting is that the Islamic State's media officers have been really, really good at exploiting these transformations. I don't know how much you know about the structure of the media department, but it's quite sophisticated. They have a number of central media outlets which produce material in various languages, various types of products, focusing on different genres. Then they have a number of provincial media offices that produce also high quality material but more localized. then they've also been really good at mobilizing individual fighters to also produce material, and they've also been good at mobilizing online supporters to participate in the circulation of this material. So there are multiple levels in the media department, and they use both centralized forms of communication and more decentralized forms of communication. And also in terms of the content, they have really managed to produce some material that is suited for our fast-paced media environment, because they have incorporated many techniques from modern film production, and we've seen that they've been really good at capturing the attention of at least the Western media and get their acts widely reproduced. But the interesting thing is that they don't really depend on being picked up by larger media organizations because they communicate on multiple platforms. They have abandoned the closed forums previously favored by jihadist group in favor of more mainstream social media platforms, and because of this, they're communicating much more directly with their audiences. And also the communication on social media allows the audience to have a much more active role in the production of this spectacle. So we are dealing with not just a different kind of speech or reach, but also a different type of communication and then a more immersive spectacle. And the interesting thing is that this is going on despite the fact that governmental authorities and social media corporations are trying to censor this. We have seen increased content moderation, but the Islamic State still get their message out. So what we're seeing is actually a non-state actor increasingly outmaneuvering traditional communication elites on these platforms. So the argument in the first half of the paper is that it's not the technique of displaying violence that makes the Islamic State exceptional. It's the group's ability to exploit the contemporary media environment to increase the public visibility of their deeds and create a more immersive spectacle. The case of the Islamic State shows that insurgents and militant groups are becoming remarkably adept at establishing their presence and manipulating their impact through imagery. And these alterations pose new questions in terms of how to theorize and respond to this form of violence in the future. Questions about who controls what, how, and when and where violence is seen, but also more specific questions about the role of this kind of material in relation to debates about radicalization, recruitment, and the process of turning violent. So, and this is something which is highly understudied and which is worthy of more attention. So that's the argument, one of my main arguments, the argument of the first half of the paper. If I now move on to the more specific analysis of the videos and my attempt to draw out the logic and the dynamics and the politics of what they're doing, I have 4 key points that I would like to share with you and have your response to. What I argue is that the public display of violence in the Islamic State videos is a form of violence which is predominantly about the effects on witnesses, which relies on the power of transgressive violence to produce a spectacular effect, which mobilizes the victim to produce the public appearance of consent, and finally, which has multiple political functions and a quite ambivalent relationship to the question of political order. So there's a lot to be said about all of these 4 points, but I'm going to try to go through them relatively quickly so that we can get to the discussion, because I would really like to have a debate with you about these arguments. But the first thing that's really important to stress is that even though the violence in the Islamic State's videos is brutal, it's not irrational. It can be really difficult to know what the individual Islamic State militant is thinking, but the overall practice of deliberately displaying cruelty against individual human bodies has a distinct logic. It's a power strategy, but the key thing here is that it's a power strategy with a significant communicative, visual, perhaps even aesthetic dimension. Because an act of violence that is staged is characteristic in that it is the display and the publicity of the violence, rather than the scales of injuries inflicted on the victim that constitute the most central aspect of the deed. Unlike instrumental violence, the public display of violence is not about defeating an enemy through material force. Rather, the political efficacy of the acts predominantly depends on the visual impact of suffering and death on a target audience. So there's always a triadic structure to this: perpetrator, victim, and spectators. And the victim is important, but he's a symbolic target. He's a political sign, while the actual targets are the spectators who witness the act, either by being present during the killing through various forms of visual media. So the victimization merely serves as an amplifier to convey a message. And therefore, the public display of violence is first and foremost a form of political speech, or perhaps more accurately, a form of violent dialogue, which is currently being amplified by modern forms of media and communication. So the key thing is that what an act of violence communicate is not something that the perpetrators can decide all by themselves. Given contemporary modes of circulation and reproduction, videos and images easily travel across cultural and national borders, thus becoming subject to multiple interpretations. So what's interesting about the Islamic State's videos is how they try to control what their videos and what their violence communicate. You will never see an Islamic State video which just show an act of physical violence. Often they will spend quite a lot of energy using different visual and verbal techniques to visually and discursively frame their deeds and try to contextualize their violence in a larger narrative. Just to give one example of this, in the videos that addresses the population in the state's part of Operation Inherent Resolve, you'll very often see this long documentary-like special effects-driven stops beginning of the video where they outline the Arab and Western states' conspiracy against the Islamic State. And you will also see images and stories about the consequences of airstrikes, part of Operation Inherent Resolve, and also some images that are very graphic that show dead children. So there's a very clear revenge motive in these videos. And it's not just violence without a story. And identifying these visual and verbal references is really important for understanding how these videos work. But I would argue it's not the only thing that we should care about, because if we want to capture how the spectacular effect is generated and why the Islamic State have managed to repeatedly shock and horrify across the globe, we also need to take the actual act of physical violence into consideration. Because with this type of violence, how the victim is executed is as important as why he's executed. In order to create a spectacle of violence that is a visually striking performance that will attract attention and have an effect on designated spectators, the perpetrators cannot rely on displaying just any form of physical violence. They must display what are called transgressive violence. That is an act of violence which is beyond witnesses' comprehension because it violates prevailing mores and sensibilities. More specifically, transgressive violence is an act of violence which is perceived as particularly horrific and incomprehensible by a target audience because it transgresses cultural and political discourses of law and morality, which manage the circulation of everyday violence. So here it's really important to emphasize that what I'm arguing is not that some acts of violence are worse than others objectively. In my opinion, there is no objective reason why killing a person by cutting his throat should be more atrocious than killing a person by burning and blowing his body to pieces in an airstrike. Yet in every given historical and cultural context, certain acts of violence are perceived as more unacceptable than others. As an example, beheading, which used to be a punishment reserved for the nobility, is today seen as a particularly horrific form of killing in many Western societies. And therefore, beheading is a really effective way of terrifying people and getting attention. And the Islamic State really mobilizes this power of transgressive violence. And now I'm going to be showing the next minute some quite graphic videos, so you can choose to look away. The Islamic States choose modes of killing perceived as very horrific, and interestingly, they also keep making their videos more graphic. The first videos were actually censored. They're not censored anymore. And as the initial shock over the beheading starts to fade, the Islamic State's media just introduce new ways of killing, like burning a hostage in a cage, drowning a group of hostages by slowly sinking them into a pool, executing a hostage by running him over with a tank, and executions performed by children down to the age of 4. So in this way, the producers of the Islamic State's videos constantly cross the boundaries of what kind of violence is expected and accepted, thereby retraining their ability to attract attention. So that's my second argument. Third, we can see the Islamic State videos as a form of violence, which is predominantly about the effects on witnesses and which relies on the visual power of transgressive violence to create the spectacular effect. But that description also fits many other forms of violent terrorist violence. That's basically the description of terrorist violence. But what separates the kind of carefully choreographed violence in the Islamic State videos from other forms of terrorist violence, such as a suicide bombing, is the way in which the individual victim is mobilized in the performance. Because the victims in the Islamic State videos are not just killed, they also take active part in the performance. More specifically, the producers of the Islamic State videos explicitly mobilize the victims to speak on their behalf by making them perform carefully staged confessions. And in these confessions, the victims are forced to assume a particular political identity just to betray it in a way. Just to give an example of this, the victim in The Message to America is forced to say, "I call on my friends, family, and loved ones to rise up against my real killers, the US government, for what will happen to me is only a result of their complacency and criminality. I guess all in all, I wish I was an American." So a confession is a performance of truth of some sort. It transforms an act of violence from a process carried out against the victim to a performance with a form of consent, in quotation marks. Or to be more precise, a public appearance of consent is produced through the distortion of the victim's voice. Thus, by making the victim confess, the producers of the Islamic State videos invokes the distortion of the victim's voice to create a violent form of truth. And this point about the production of some form of truth takes me to my final point, which is this discussion of the broader political function of the Islamic State videos. And I know that this is the part of my paper that needs more unpacking. But I'm going to try to say it anyway because I think it's important and I would like to have a discussion with you about it. Because my argument is that that these videos actually have multiple political functions for the Islamic State, and that they have a quite ambiguous relation to the question of political order. Because on the one hand, you can see the Islamic State's videos as this form of destructive terrorist violence that we've been confronted with so many times throughout decades. Through these public executions of individual citizens, the Islamic State contests the political power of sovereign states they otherwise have no chance of defeating in a conventional military confrontation. The execution of Foley and Haynes and Al-Qasasbari were not executions of individuals, they were executions of American, British, and Jordanian citizens. And with a British accent so central to his performance, Jihadi John addresses President Obama directly: "The life of this American citizen, Obama, depends on your next decision." So in this way, the Islamic State convert military weakness into strength by hitting the enemy at its most vulnerable point, the individual citizen, thereby challenging modern political sovereignty based on the care of individual life. However, the display of cruelty in the Islamic State's videos, I would argue, is more than just a disruption of a given order and a way of undermining a sovereign enemy. In many ways, the ISIS display of violence is as much a manifestation of sovereignty and a way of enforcing a moral and political order through the visual display of strength and authority. And I'm going to be showing graphic images for the final time now. There's a strange combination of transgressive violence and civil order in many of the Islamic State videos. The burning of Moaz al-Qasasbeh is as much about displaying the disciplined, well-ordered, trained ISIS fighters as it is about displaying the actual burning of the Jordanian pilot. You are no longer fighting an insurgency. We are an Islamic army and a state that has been accepted by a large number of Muslims worldwide, Jihadi John claims before beheading Foley. So combined with the fact that a large part of the Islamic State's overall media output consists of photo series and stories and imagery that should promote military affairs, government, civil order, and the life in the caliphate, the Islamic State's visual narrative ends up being a strange combination of both brutal violence but also a vision of a comprehensive society. Chaos and order, destruction and creation at once. And this is perhaps most clearly exemplified by the videos with the Cup of the Caliphate, child soldiers that undergo military and religious training and perform executions. Because these videos certainly has the potential to terrify, seeing that children carrying out execution is considered transgressive in many, if not most, societies. But they also convey a form of presentation of a committed army of child soldiers. They kind of communicate the strength, persistence, and order of the caliphate. We have a state with a disciplined people, and the next generation is already ready to carry on the project. So the argument I'm trying to make here in the final part of the paper is that yes, this is a form of terrorist violence, but the Islamic State is not just a terrorist organization, it's also a totalitarian state-building project. And this is reflected in how they mobilize violence and display violence. The public display of violence in the Islamic State's videos is as much an integral element of a state project as it is a form of terrorism. As many times before throughout human history, the desecrated body is mobilized as a principal sign in founding the nation, and sovereign power is made real in the wounds of the body, as individual pain is made a spectacle and projected as power. So even though it's convenient to dismiss the Islamic State violence as nihilism, terrorism, and exceptional evil, what they're doing is actually a bit more complicated, and it's necessary to take this into consideration when we analyze, theorize, and respond to this form of violence. So, thank you.